Welcome to the Azure for Sports podcast, hosted by the Azure for Sports team at Microsoft.
Hello, and welcome to a new edition of the Azure for Sports podcast. I'm Suzanne Tedrick, and as always, I'm joined by my partner in all things Azure, Mr. John Flynn. John, what's going on, man?
Oh, everything. Hey, Suzanne, how are you? It's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I know I say this every time, but I'm really pumped for this episode, right? But this one is true, right? We have a repeat guest, someone that was near and dear to our hearts. We work with him closely every single day. He's an award-winning cloud solution architect for Microsoft, and don't forget, an author. So welcome everybody to Jake Switzer.
Hey everybody. Hey John. Hey Suzanne. Thanks for having me on again. It's great being a repeat guest. Always fun jumping on with y'all and talking about all things Azure and all things sports.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming in. So the reason why we asked you to come on is that we get the privilege of working with sports clients on a daily basis, right? From leagues to individual clubs and teams. And the thing that we hear the most is, how do I build an analytics architecture using Azure, right? And so we do a lot of work with that. Suzanne and Jake, you've got the battle scars and still continue to get them to make this happen. But then obviously the next thing that we hear is, how do we make that easier, right? For people who have, maybe they haven't been on Azure before, maybe they're coming from on-prem or a different cloud provider, or maybe they just don't have a lot of time or a lot of resources to be able to do this. How do we create the architecture needed to build these wonderful analytical tools on Azure quicker, right? So Jake and his wonderful team have come together and done just that, right? So they built this framework, an easy button, if you would, for building an analytics architecture on Azure. We like alliteration. But one of the cool things here is that we're going to do something, Suzanne, we've never done before, as we continue to just break the production qualities here and go for the stars, is we're going to do a live demo, right? So we're very excited. All of those who are listening on Spotify or Amazon or Apple Music, you go look at us on YouTube. I mean, Jake sounds amazing, but he looks even better when he's sharing his screen and he's actually doing this in real time. So we're not gonna hold thumbs or cross fingers because Jake is that good, but we're gonna do a live demo of a one-click deployment of an analytics architecture to Azure. Right? There's crowds cheering everywhere. I can hear them. So lofty goals for us. If you didn't know Jake, if you know Jake, you know it's a piece of cake. It's just a cakewalk. Suzanne, anything to say before we get into it?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. This is a podcast of many, many firsts. Our first repeat guest and an author, no less.
Yes.
I think we may have some production.
If you remember from a previous episode, Jake is the wonderful author of an Azure certification book on data fundamentals. Highly, highly, highly would recommend taking the time to take a look. I myself have been using it, and Jake, I'll be taking the DP 900 very soon.
Nice.
Wish me luck, but I know I have a great resource.
Yeah, if you pass it, then let me know. If you didn't, then just don't let me know that you return the book. But just keep that to yourself.
I will.
But yeah.
I will say though, that's the only reason I passed my DP 900 is due to Jake Switzer. So thanks for that, man.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful book. Highly recommended. And yes, this is the first time that we're doing a live demonstration. So really delving into how do we bring value to all of you. We talk not only about the business, but the technical and the art of the possible. So I think this is going to be a wonderful demo, and I know that with Jake, I have no worries whatsoever. So I know it's going to be great.
Crossing my fingers.
No pressure, Jake.
No pressure at all. So without further ado, all of you listening on Spotify, come to YouTube because we're about to go live.
Awesome.
Jake, my friend, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Suzanne. So as John mentioned, one of the things that we get requests for a lot at Microsoft from our sports customers, especially the teams, is how do we build out performance analytics architectures that are easy to use, highly scalable, can take in large amounts of data at both batch and in real time, and then how can we use those architectures to do whatever we want to do with that type of data. And so over the last several years, we've used modern data warehouse type best practices to develop these type of solutions in Azure. And so earlier this year, I published an article that includes a commonly used architecture for all the teams that I've worked with. That includes Azure Data Factory for the orchestration and movement of data, Azure Data Lake Storage for storage of raw data files, and then cleansed data files that are ultimately used for data science purposes or for data engineering, and Azure Databricks, which is the key engine behind a lot of our data engineering and data science usages, and Azure SQL Database, which is ultimately used as a data mart, if you will, or a storage for report-ready data. So this is a smaller subset of data that's stored in Azure Data Lake Storage that's ultimately displayed by a Power BI report, or if you're not using Power BI, something like Tableau, or a custom application that you could host on Azure App Service.
Jake, let me ask you real quick, Mike.
Yeah.
So looking at all these bits and pieces, someone coming fresh into Azure or someone coming fresh into the cloud per se, should they look at this and go, oof, that's a lot I need to get my head around here? Or is this something that is easy if you know what to do?
Yeah, so it is, you can think of it as splitting things up into chunks, right? And taking a step back and thinking, what are my organizational needs? Because for different organizations, maybe certain services are more useful than others. So if your software development team has a background in, let's say, C#, then maybe instead of Azure Data Factory or Databricks for some of these usages, you could use an Azure function. Which down below the architecture here, and even below the data flow, I do have components and alternatives that you could use. But it's thinking about how these different services can be used. So there is a lot to kind of digest as far as what the services are used for, and you can definitely go deep down, all of these different products and get really, really technical with all of them. But to get started at like a 100 or 200 level, it's really, it's just taking a step back and thinking about, what are we ultimately trying to do? For me, it's a pretty easy to get started with architecture. And then because of its flexibility, you can go wild with it. You can do whatever you want to with it from a data engineering, data science perspective, regardless of whether it's batch processing or streaming or near real time. There's a lot of different things that you can do with it. And like I said, depending on the skill set of your team, you can also add or subtract certain components just to make it easier for kind of the getting started pieces of it.
Awesome.
Cool. Yeah. So as I mentioned, the architecture itself was something that we published in early May. But as you can see on the screen, there are a lot of components here to it. And underneath all of those components are also authentication and authorization pieces. So within Azure Data Factory, there's a concept of linked services. This is just how Data Factory manages the authentication credentials for storage and compute services like Data Lake and Azure Databricks. And then there's also authentication to Data Lake Storage and to Azure SQL that need to be considered. So what users can actually connect and read data from these different services. In addition to that, if you're using Azure Key Vault for storing secrets and different certs for password management, then the users or different users need to be able to access that. So there's a lot of setup that goes into this architecture, and that's what I'm going to show today is how to easily deploy that with one click. So if you go down, if you're on this architecture page and you go down to the very bottom, there is a deploy this scenario section. Clicking on this link takes you to that article. So the blog post quickly goes over what are the services that are deployed, what are optional services. So Data Factory, Data Lake Storage, and Databricks. Those are the services that are going to be used throughout all of these different, different solutions. And then Key Vault, SQL Database, Azure Event Hub, are normally optional. So if you're going to be reporting against data that's stored in data lake, so you're using like a Delta format that has a good strong structure applied to the data, you don't need a SQL database for more of a persistent storage, indexing, all of that. Definitely don't need to deploy a SQL database. If your organization already has a Key Vault instance that's deployed, kind of a separation of services, by who manages infrastructure and who manages data, then you definitely don't have to deploy the Key Vault. And then if you don't have a real-time streaming use case, then there's no reason to deploy Azure Event Hub. So, all of that is taken into consideration. And of course, in addition to services that are deployed, the template will set up the necessary permissions for authentication and authorization for the managed identities that are deployed and the user that's deploying it. So I'll go over how that works here in a second.
So Jake, if you're in varying degrees of your journey to cloud, right? What are the bare minimum requirements that you have to be able to click one of these buttons and deploy that? I mean, obviously you need an Azure account, you need an Azure subscription, and then you don't need to have 1,000 things done before you come in here and do it, right?
Right.
Once you're set up on Azure, you're one clicking away, right?
Yeah, that's it. So really, you just need a Azure subscription, and with that subscription, you're obviously going to have an identity within Azure AD. So you'll need to provide that information as well as the object ID that is tied to the to your user identity. So at the bottom here in the prereqs section, I have a small PowerShell script that you can use to retrieve that object ID. So this can be run from any PowerShell window on your desktop. It can be run from the Azure command line, however you want to run it. So, one thing to keep in mind, just replace this parameter in here, this AAD username, with your user identity from Azure AD, and then run this on PowerShell, and you'll retrieve the GUID, the object ID that's tied to your user identity. And you'll want to save that off for later. I'll show here in a second where you'll want to input that whenever you go and deploy. Ultimately, what that's going to be used for is tying that user, so the user that's deploying the template, to the appropriate role-based access controls for Azure Blob Storage, for Azure SQL Database, and for Azure SQL or Azure Key Vault. So all of that will kind of deploy, and authorization will get set up the way that it should be set up. So with that, this article is fun and cool, but it is just text. If you would like to browse the code, all of this is done through Bicep, and it is, this is more of a newer infrastructure as code scripting language. So this is, if you're familiar with ARM or you're familiar with Terraform, it's almost a combination of the two. But it is the sort of the modern way that Microsoft is deploying services, or opening up users to be able to deploy services in a CI/CD pipeline, or and more of a deployment as code sort of setup. So if you would like to browse the code, feel free to click on this browse code button. It'll take you to the GitHub where all of that is repoed. But if you want to just get in and deploy to Azure, click on this deploy to Azure button. This will take you to your Azure subscription, and it'll pop up a prompt where you can start deploying all of these services. So obviously, kind of the first thing to get squared away is what subscription you're going to be deploying to, what resource group. So if you have an existing resource group with all of these services, or where you want to house all of these services, feel free to deploy it there. Something a lot of customers or a lot of sports teams ask me is, how do we do resource group management? So the way that I look at resource groups is typically these are the services that are going to be used by a certain application. So if you're going to be doing data engineering, and all of your sports performance analytics data engineering parts are going to make up a single solution, then all of that would go within a single resource group. Now, best practices for production deployments have identity and networking components in a separate resource group, data engineering pieces in a separate resource group. But for this, think of this as more of you're going to be doing rapid deployment, proof of concept. So that's why the Key Vault deployed to the same resource group as Databricks and Data Lake Storage in this case. But something to kind of keep in mind whenever you're planning out production style deployments. So I don't have a resource group created yet, so I'm going to go in here and create a new one called Sports Analytics. I'm going to set my region to East US 2. So let me get to that. For this location, you can definitely change it to another location. I'm going to keep mine as East US 2. What this prompt in here is saying is that for all of these services that are deployed, just use the resource group location. Now, if there are some requirements that have you maybe changing that so that the resource group sits in one location and all the services sit in a different one, you can definitely change that to another region. But for now, I'm just going to leave this at the default.
Jake, would the best practice be choose the region that is closest to where you're sitting? Would that be a best practice? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely. Wherever you're going to be sitting, for performance reasons, that's always going to be the best practice. Now, there are obviously going to be maybe different requirements. So if there are certain services that aren't deployed in certain regions, then maybe you want to deploy it to a different region. But for the most part, these services, Data Lake Storage, Data Factory, Databricks, these are all commonly used services that are available in just about every region that we have. So good question. The next step, I'm just going to add my Azure AD username. And again, this username is going to be applied the proper role-based access controls for reading data out of Data Lake Storage, reading and managing secrets in Azure Key Vault, and then also it's going to be given Azure AD permissions for the SQL database. So the username, unfortunately, is not good enough. So I'll also have to add that object ID, which I mentioned again. You can use PowerShell in the script that's in the prereqs section of the article to grab. So once you grab that, just paste. Now here comes the fun naming bits. And as anyone who's ever deployed a service to Azure knows, every service has a different set of rules for how you can name a particular service. And it can be annoying at times because not every service has the same set of rules. So what I did, if you scroll over this little information button, I included all of the rules that are specific to each of these services. So as you can see, for Data Lake Storage Gen 2, storage account names must be between 3 and 24 characters in length, only numbers and lowercase letters, so no dashes, no underscores, and it must be unique within Azure. And so within the template itself, if you add a name that is not unique, it will tell you. It'll spit back a nice red prompt saying, hey, this is already used, so you can go in and change it. So I'll go in here, copy and paste my name in here. As any good cooking show, I've already kind of baked out some of these names. For a Data Factory is pretty loose with how its naming convention is set up, so I can use any sort of kind of nomenclature for that. So that's why I have the dashes in here. Databricks has some rules, so definitely be sure to scroll over the information icon here. So I have my workspace name, Databricks npip. So no public IP. This is just a way to set up additional security, network isolation for a Databricks workspace. You can definitely set that as true or false. In the grand scheme of the proof of concept, it doesn't matter regardless of whether you're going to enable npip or not. It's a very easy setup, and so that's why by default I have it set to true. It's an easy way to make sure that additional security is applied. So I have that set. For deploy Event Hub, as I mentioned earlier, maybe we don't need an event hub. Maybe we don't have a real-time streaming use case. So I'm going to set that to false for now, just because for my particular use case, I don't need streaming data. For the event hub name, I can leave this blank, so I can delete the text that's in here, or I can just leave it as is. Nothing's going to happen because the part of the script that would be run to deploy the event hub isn't going to run because I'm setting this to false. Key Vault, I am going to go ahead and run that. Key Vault also had some very specific rules, so be sure to highlight over that and check it out. The most important rule is that there cannot be another Key Vault with the same name. So, definitely get creative with how you name your Key Vault, so that you don't run into any sort of naming issues with it. Deploy SQL database. I'm going to go ahead and deploy a SQL database. I'm going to give that, I'm going to give the logical server this name here. And something to keep in mind with the Azure SQL database is that while there isn't a physical server that you're working with, so you're not going to be able to work with like a SQL Server agent or any of the server level features, there is still a logical server, which is more or less just an endpoint that allows you to connect to your SQL databases. So it's more of a logical kind of housing around any SQL databases. For the database name itself, I'm going to give that a quick change to Sports Analytics DB. And then I'm going to give a SQL user login and password. Something to keep in mind with Azure SQL Database, it does require SQL authentication for the admin. Excuse me, for the admin. Now you can disable that. You don't need to use SQL authentication for any other purposes. By default, the template is going to use both SQL authentication or enable both SQL authentication and Azure AD authentication. So you can tie in your Azure AD identities for better security. But for this initial bit, I'm going to set my SQL admin username and password. Something to keep in mind too, just because of certain requirements for the template itself, even if I decide to not deploy a SQL database, you'll still need to enter in a username and password. So if you're not going to deploy the SQL database, just put in, just some blank text, some lorem ipsum, nothing crazy, right? And nothing will happen with it. Nothing will get deployed, but it's a requirement for the template itself to get deployed. So let me change that back to true. So now that I have my template sort of written out, I can hit review and create. This will verify and validate any sort of potential issues, and just let me know that I'm good to go for actually hitting create and deploy. So when I hit create, all of these services are going to get deployed along with the appropriate authentication bits. So I'll go ahead and hit create. Now, when you hit create, it will take you to this page right here where it'll show you, hey, this is what's getting deployed. So this will take a minute or two to finish. Once that's done, we'll go into the actual services just to look at what's done underneath the hood. And as you can see, some of these services are already getting spun up. They're getting provisioned right in front of me. So this is the process. Again, it's
and this is as if you're doing it in a real-time basis, right? So if I'm coming in and I'm doing this as a real use case, this is exactly the behavior and amount of time that it's going to take. I don't have to now go and figure out something else to do for a couple of hours and let this do its thing and then come back to it, right?
Right. Exactly. And that's something that I've talked with customers about before, is that because of how easy it is to deploy services to the cloud, it's much easier to try and test things out. Previously or in years past, a lot of these services, especially distributed compute services like Spark, which Databricks is, it would take months to procure hardware, to set up networking, to get everything kind of ready to go. Now I'm deploying this in just a matter of a minute or two, and I can immediately get started. And then if I don't want to keep anything around, I can delete it all.
Right, that's a great point. And I think another thing that is also amazing to me, right, is that this is the same architecture and the same set of technologies that are running some of the most incredible analytic programs and analytic tools that we have across our sports properties, right? This is the very thing that they use. Granted, they may be scaling out, of course, right? But this is how everyone started, and this is how everyone's entry point into building a great basis for performing analytics within fan engagement, player analytics, business analysis, etc. This is it. This is the real deal, right? And this is absolutely incredible.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So, like I said at the beginning, this architecture is based off of tried and true best practices that we've leveraged throughout several different teams. And really, the design decision behind it wasn't just that the services themselves were used, but the flexibility of it. So, I mentioned earlier, if you are working with a team that has a .NET C# background and you want to continue to leverage those skills, well, fine, throw in an Azure function. You can orchestrate that through Data Factory, or you can orchestrate that through file triggers in data lake storage. There's a lot that you can do with the architecture to make it your own. And within the blog post itself, I have several of those alternatives that you can use listed out, just for other ideas if you're looking for new ideas.
I think that's awesome. And Suzanne, we should have had a countdown on this one, right? Because how many times do you feel the question, well, how long is it going to take to deploy? Well,
so isn't the rule of thumb 900 seconds? 900 seconds altogether for
900 seconds. That's it. 900 seconds. As granular as that. But I think this is cool. And to your point, though, Jake, right? I mean, a lot of what we do in our day jobs, which isn't this podcast, funnily enough, I know we seem extremely professional, and this would be our gig, right? But is we help sports customers with those very decisions that you just spoke about, right? What is your current language of choice? What is your current preferred landing, etc.? And the way that we see a lot of these successful deployments of a POC or an MVP around an analytical tool is to start with that business case first and work backwards from there. Because once we work backwards from there, we're getting to actually start deploying here. This is 900 seconds or less, right? This was amazing. We're already starting to get kicking. I'm going to let you go as well and stop blabbing. But starting at that point doesn't then mean we've defined what a business case would be, and it's going to take us, to your point, months to procure, etc. It doesn't even take us hours or minutes here. We were 900 seconds away. So Jake, back to you.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, no. So, as you could see, it takes no time to deploy all of those services that are used for storage, for data orchestration, for ingestion, for data engineering, machine learning. All of that sort of stuff is built in and deployed really, really quickly. So if I click on this, go to resource group, I can actually see all of my services that are built in. And keep in mind, these are the services themselves. And now I can go into Databricks. I can go into the workspace. I can start developing new notebooks, new Python, R-driven notebooks that use Spark clusters to do maybe spatial analytics on XYZ coordinate data, something like that. I can go into Data Factory and actually start to connect these pieces together for data movement. And something that I mentioned earlier with the deployment of the template, it's not just enough to deploy the services. Something that's also important is authorization and authentication. So how does Data Factory know how to communicate with the services that were deployed? So storage being SQL and data lake storage, and then also how to retrieve credentials from Azure Key Vault. So as I mentioned, within Data Factory, there is a concept of linked services. And within linked services, all of that is just connection information to storage and compute. Now, as you can see, I have linked services that got deployed for Key Vault, for SQL, and for data lake storage. The only one that's missing here is Databricks. Now, the reason that Databricks isn't included is because a cluster needs to be provisioned and stood up or to have a link service deployed for Databricks. And the only reason that I don't do that here is because Databricks clusters, for as long as they run, they are burning the Azure meter. So there is a cost associated with it. So instead of, building out a template that included surprise costs within it, I just decided to stay away from it. It's an easy service to deploy, the link service for Databricks, but you'll need to go in and provision a cluster or set the link service so that it deploys a cluster on the go as Databricks is kicked off within, or a notebook is executed within Data Factory. So wanted to stay away from that, but it's definitely something that's easily added, right?
So Jake, let me ask you real quick. The deployment that you've got here through the script, the template that you've got, are there any costs associated with this once you've hit that deploy button?
Yep. Good question. Really good question. So the only thing that will spin up a cost, or there are a couple of things, right? So it's storage and data lake storage, which is pennies on the dollar. It's super cheap storage, especially compared to like a SQL database or to a NoSQL database. It's just storing files in the cloud. Key Vault, there is a minimal cost associated with storing keys and secrets, but there's nothing stored in Key Vault at the moment, so it's not costing you anything. The only thing that's going to incur some cost is the SQL database itself. Now, for that reason, I've set it up to be one of the lower tiers. So let me go to compute and storage. So it is just a general purpose V8. So it does start off at $1,400, but you can use things like reserved instances to cut back on the cost, or you can even go in here and just scale it down, right? So this is the one area where there is a cost associated to keep in mind. So definitely, if you would like to scale it down, just go to the SQL database within the portal, go to compute and storage, and then just scale it down. So you can scale it back to one of the DTU based models, or keep it at general purpose and scale down on the vCores. But that's the one area to kind of keep in mind whenever you do a deployment of this template.
Cool.
Yep. And so the last thing, or the last couple of things to keep in mind is that, as I mentioned, your user identity within Azure AD that's used to deploy this service, and then the managed identities for Data Factory, they need to have the appropriate roles tied to them so that your user and so Data Factory can read and write data to data lake storage and read secrets from Key Vault. So if I go into the Key Vault and I go to access control and I go to role assignments, I can see, if I scroll down to Key Vault's secret user, I can see my username and I can see the managed identity for Data Factory. And if I use the same sort of steps within the data lake account, if I go to Azure control, go to role assignments, I can scroll down to the bottom. I can see storage blob data contributor has been assigned to my Data Factory managed identity and to my user identity. Something to keep in mind, storage blob data contributor, that allows these identities to read and write data to the service. Very different than contributor. Storage blob data contributor is what's needed for reading data and for writing data to the data lake account. Now, of course, you can definitely go in and add additional users, additional user groups, additional managed identities. But to kind of get started with the setup, this is all you needed to get going. So with that, let's say that you've done some testing and you want to delete the services. You can go up here to delete resource group and then type in the resource group name, hit delete, and then you've deleted all of the services. So within, maybe 10, 15 minutes, we've gone through, deployed all of these services, gone through a quick walkthrough of what each service includes in the deployment, and then we've also deleted it. So we're done with our testing with it. So really easy.
Did it live.
Oh yeah, all live. Yeah. So If I'm sweating a little bit, it's because of all the pressure. No, I'm just kidding.
No pressure. We did it live. There was no glitches whatsoever. The demo gods were smiling upon you, Jake. This was fantastic. I mean, we built up an architecture and then we just destroyed it.
Yep.
It was fantastic.
Exactly. So it's incredible to see just how easy it is to deploy these services. And it's really a testament to our product teams who work on template languages like Bicep. It's very easy to stand up all of these different services and get going really quickly with different solutions. And then once you're done, you're done.
So Jake, this is fantastic, and yeah, you see, we didn't put any pressure, and it went beautifully as we expected it to. This is fantastic, and so just thinking, taking a step back, and I guess looking at the architecture, a lot of this subscribes to the well architected framework that we talk a lot about here within Azure. For those that might not be familiar, could you high level walk us through what is well architected, or WAF?
Yeah, so it's the idea of deploying services in a way that are easy to manage, and that logically makes sense. So, something that I mentioned earlier, when you're thinking of production ready deployments and solutions, where are certain identity and networking components going to live? Where are my data engineering components? Where maybe I have maybe I'm deploying an application to Azure. Where are those components going to live? So it's the design behind how my Azure deployments or Azure implementation, how that design is going to work. So it's more or less, it's organization, right? It's the idea that everything is in a logical sort of setup without any sort of any confusion as to what services are getting used, where are they getting used, who manages what services, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's wonderful that you can just deploy things on Azure at the click of a button, and there's, I think, over 600 services. But you want there to be a rhyme and a reason to what you're doing. The last thing you want to do is open up your Azure environment and okay, I see this virtual machine that's costing me $10,000 a month. I have no idea what it actually does. I don't know why it's here. I don't know why I'm using it. I don't even know if it's appropriate for what I'm using it for. So really applying a framework, a set of guidelines, so that when you are building on Azure, it is logical, it's making sense, you're not spending ungodly amounts of money and so forth. And so all of that's really important. So thinking about what we've just deployed here, what are, I guess, some of the use cases that you can see our client base potentially using this architecture?
Yeah. And just really quick, I just want to show everyone. So I'm sure everyone saw the little icon at the top that the resources were deleted. The web page itself is static, but if I hit refresh in here, all those resources are gone. So no issues there.
So no charges as well, right? So everything that was burning any sort of charge or incurring charge has shut down immediately once that resource group was deleted.
Yep, exactly. So all of that is gone. You don't have to worry about your manager coming to you one day with a big bill saying, "Hey, what is this?" So easy way to skirt by that. But yeah, so back to your question, Suzanne, about what solutions can be deployed. So a lot of the solutions that we've worked on with this architecture have been around data engineering and data science. Whether it's a lot of sports performance data. So think of traditional box scores. How do we store off years and years and years, seasons upon seasons of data for different analysis, and then to also be used with newer sets of data like spatial tracking data, XYZ coordinates of what are players doing during the course of a game on the field, on the court, on the pitch, however you want to call that. And then in addition to that sort of data, also biomechanical data. So if you think of like a pitcher, how is their arm moving during a game or during certain pitches? All of that data can be stored off in data lake storage. It can all be processed with Databricks, with Spark, and analyzed through using different machine learning models, and then ultimately reported it against for actual analysis. So if you're thinking about personnel decisions through free agency, through trades, through the draft, or even different play styles. So how well do certain sets within a game work out? So how well do certain players work with other players based off of their skill sets? All of that can be achieved with this architecture.
So I think that's amazing, right? I mean, one of the things that is super cool is that we get to have a million conversations, right? And this architecture is a manifestation of all of those in terms of it's able to do each and every one of these use cases, right? But listening to these true tried and tested use cases from our clients, right? There's always a magic word in there, and that word is data, right? So is it true? Let me lead the witness, Your Honor. Is it true that the more data you have, the better your analytic solution is going to be?
Oh, well, I'll give you the consulting answer. It depends, right? So more data is always fun, right? More data, it gives you more flexibility, more freedom to make wild assumptions and come up with really cool and interesting things. But more data can also create stagnation. It can bog you down. It can be very intimidating. Looking at very messy, unstructured or semi-structured data, and that's where services like Spark really come into play and bring a lot of value. Is all right. Well, this is you take a look at it like at a giant piece of JSON that's nested multiple times and just kind of a behemoth, and you're like, well, that's intimidating. But parsing that out, pulling out pieces of data, and using distributed computing platforms like Spark to process all of that data, flatten it out in a way that's easy to look at, can provide a lot of value. Or it can show you, hey, this data actually has no value whatsoever. Let's not continue doing anything, or creating hypothesis off of this data. It's just useless. There's definitely a lot there to it. It's more on the side of, yes, provides a lot of value, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. Like, all right, well, this is a lot. I'm not going to be able to do anything with this.
Jake, I appreciate your candor in the "it depends" answer, because I mean I know people hate it, but it literally is true. And as you were talking about that, I thought of two things specifically: the fact that we have such a proliferation of data that you can always get to a point of analysis paralysis when there's just so much. Where do you even unravel that and begin? And then maybe on the other side of that is talking about, is all data really meaningful to us? We can have these data points for sure, but can we derive any meaning from them, any insight or anything valuable? And so sometimes having more data, to your point, it really does depend.
Yep.
One of the things that and you're spot on there, right? One of the things that we see from experience is that analysis paralysis is twofold. Number one, the sheer amount of data that's available is cumbersome, because do I use this set, that set? Do I use both sets? Do I use 900 of them? I don't really know what to do. So people kind of get intimidated at that point. That's how do I start, right? There's too much out there. If I don't start, then I don't have to worry about it. Then the other one is, okay, cool, I did something and I got a result that I liked. Let me do something more. That was a result I liked even more. Let's do something more. There's always that next step. Let's do something more, versus delivering a result and then making a decision upon that, right? At what point, Jake, do you see in the experience of working with our teams, with our customers here, where you're good enough for phase one or stage one?
Yeah. So sorry, could you repeat the question?
Easy question. This is an easy, really question for you. Easy question is that how much analysis is good to get started?
So I think, I hate to keep going back to it depends, right? But it really does. I think a lot of teams have done a great job over the years of creating creating like sabermetrics. And so there is a baseline for, what is a good pitcher or what is an efficient shot in a basketball game. And so the start is there, the baseline is there. It's how do I take the newest sets of data, because technology, as it's forever just getting more and more, more improved and more just kind of enhanced by what it does. There's so many new data points that are coming in, and there is a, what do we do with this? How can we leverage spatial data to really get into different things? So there's a lot there to that.
Simple question, I understand, so it's fine. One of the things that we've noticed in terms of how effective is my analytics program at XYZ team league, whatever it is, it really is starting with that business problem first, right? To your point, there is a baseline on a player's performance. There's a baseline on a ticket sales average price. There's a lot of baselines that we can do. So getting started with that business use case is what we've seen typically leads to success. Jake, I love that the demo god smiled favorably upon you, my friend. You did a great job over here. I think this was a very good session to understand just how simple it is. I mean, we've been talking for less than an hour. We've spoken about mostly some gobbledygook from me, but we've spoken about some real use cases for analytics in sports today. We built an analytics platform on Azure in which you can go and actually start creating some real value out of, and then we struck it down, right? So we can see how easy it doesn't live on forever, right? So Jake, thank you as always. I have a feeling you're going to be our first three-peat guest as well. So crossing my fingers for
Nice.
that. But thank you. This was amazing.
Thank you, Jake. We really appreciate it. And with that, we're going to wrap up our episode, but we hope you enjoyed. We hope you enjoyed our first technical demonstration. Please let us know how you feel about this episode and many others. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you soon.